Hi, and welcome to Cybereason's Malicious Life B-Side. I'm Ran Levy. A while ago, we dedicated 2 episodes to China's Golden Shield, the massive IT infrastructure project that combined internet censorship with pervasive state surveillance. Sometime later, we did another mini-series on China, this time about its unrestricted warfare philosophy and troubled relationship with Western technology companies such as Nortel. In these episodes, we talked a lot about how the Chinese government tries to enforce its rules and regulations on the country's intranet and how it restricts Western influence. But what we didn't talk about is why. Why do the Chinese try to control the flow of information in and out of the country and force Western companies such as Google and Apple to play by its rules? In order to answer these questions, it's not enough to be like tourists who sample the country's food, music, and architecture for a few days and then leave. China, as you probably know, has a very long history that goes back thousands of years and an extremely rich and varied culture. This, in turn, has a direct impact on how the Chinese view the global internet and the Western influence it brings. Our guest in the Unrestricted Warfare miniseries was retired Lieutenant Colonel Bill Hagestad, who, after serving in the Marines for 3 decades, became a visiting scholar at China's People Liberation Army, and one of the very few Western people who developed close ties with high-ranking military officials. Bill talked to Nate Nelson, our producer, and part of the conversation revolved around the impact China's history and culture has on its decisions and actions regarding the internet. That part of the interview had no room in the context of the miniseries back then, and so we decided to save it for later and play it for you in a dedicated B-side episode. That's it from me. Enjoy the interview.
Could you just talk a little bit about what we get wrong over here about them?
Yes, this will be difficult. Not for me, but for you and your audience to perhaps participate and understand. They are human beings much like we are, and culturally and historically, they have much deeper roots of cooperation with the United States and Western countries than, say, we have as a short-term memory here in the United States. And when I say that, and how that ties into the cyber realm, is the fact that if you look back at the early 1900s, 1910, 1912, specifically the Boxer Rebellion, there were 7 countries, including the United States, Russia, Germany, Japan, France, the UK, who essentially occupied the sovereign soil and territory of China. Now, what that did is it put a huge stain on their regard for Western cultures. For us, it was like, well, whatever, we're going to go on trade and our military has to be there to protect our interests. And the Chinese saw that as strange, as like, well, we're not threatening you militarily. Heck, we don't even have a military. We're still fighting with swords. And they saw this essentially as a Western narrative that they had to match. Bring it forward, as I mentioned, to 2009 when the U.S. Department of Defense announced the Cyber Command non-componentized equivalent. In 2010, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians coincidentally said, well, we must match the U.S. When you link that back historically with the Chinese regard to us, it's as if they want to keep pace, but by the same token, they know that we are not going to, as Americans, attack them militarily unless someone perhaps crazily pushes the wrong button or has a bad day, not indicative of current political situation. What that means then is that the way that the Chinese regard us is one of curiosity, but also one of an allied view. That doesn't mean that we have to be China lovers all. In fact, I've encountered folks that are viscerally just full of hatred and venom against the Chinese. But then when I ask them if they've ever been there or experienced the culture, they say, no, it's based on what I read or hear about in the media. And I said, well, then give it another chance. I mean, if you look historically during World War II, for example, certainly the Korean conflict was a bit of an exception. The Chinese have always tried to be our allies. A lot of it depends on the leadership. And if you look at perhaps post-1949, when Mao Zedong took over, there has been definitely a change. But nonetheless, with, for example, Deng Xiaoping and Nixon and Kissinger attempting to open relationships in the early 70s, there has always been this overture of friendliness and willingness to work together. I will tell you, in one of my experiences in Beijing in '83, my friend, a fellow student, and I walked around a corner in one of the deep, dark streets of Beijing. I mean, it was not deep and dark in the sense of it being strange. It was just a deep and dark street, literally. And they looked at us and they're like, in perfect Chinese, they said, "Oh, look, friends, the Russians are back to help us again." And we're like, well, no, we're not Russians. We're American students studying here at Nakai University in Tianjin. And they're like, oh, whoa, thank you. We did not like the Russians when they were here. They were very rude, took advantage of us, and tried to impose their political will on us, which we do not appreciate. So in and of itself gives you a little bit of a taste of the way that the Chinese view other cultures, of those that they have not perhaps had a good relationship with.
Malicious Life is sponsored by Cybereason. There is nothing better than a live simulation, especially when you're fighting cyber attacks that are becoming more and more complex. Defenders are always looking for the critical edge to reverse the attacker's advantage, and it's only through live attack simulations that you can truly see what might provide you that winning edge. Join Cybereason's global attack simulations to watch firsthand how attackers use the latest infiltration methods and execute on sophisticated malicious operations, and more importantly, how to end these operations before they happen. Reserve your spot today at cybereason.com/attacksim.
You know, your point about the Chinese colonial history is so interesting to me, because I've never thought about, because now I'm for the first time ever thinking about Chinese the Chinese government policy towards Western companies in this context. Is there a causal connection between China's sort of internal keeping, Facebook, Skype out of the country, and their sort of national history of colonialization?
Well, I would. You're on a good point there. I wouldn't say that it's associated necessarily with colonialism and the efforts to thwart it from a Chinese perspective. It's more a fact that they want to keep their sovereign space, thus the internet, as clean and wholesome and as Chinese as they possibly can. You'd mentioned, or perhaps you have not yet mentioned it, but the Golden Shield project, the Great Firewall of China, was essentially meant as a way to keep their space clean, so that no one would possibly ever accuse them of hacking any other country or causing any malfeasance. And I will tell you, with the 13 or so current laws, everything from espionage to counter-espionage to privacy of children to privacy of individuals, all equates to national security, and it's enforced by not only the National Cyber Police, the Gong'anbu, as well as the Chinese military. The Chinese government takes this very seriously in terms of wanting to keep their space safe from any sort of Western influences. The advent of, for example, any number of the social media platforms that are there are meant for the Chinese to use. But in essence, they also will then block Western companies such as Google. The Google issue is an interesting one, because the servers for Google, as it's now known, were obviously located in Hong Kong. But because they were promoting destabilization and anti-communist rhetoric, even perhaps positioning themselves as anti-communist leadership, naturally, when you do that as a company or an individual to a country like China, they can basically say, you're not welcome here, and basically cancel their ability to allow indexed or non-indexed searches inside the People's Republic of China. I will tell you, on one of my trips, I took a Chromebook just to test it. As you know, Chromebooks are Google OS based. None of it worked at all, period. Now, I will tell you another interesting story. Some of my military contacts have Gmail addresses.
You can stop me if I'm taking this too far, but it occurs to me that, your explanation that they want to keep their internet sort of clean and wholly Chinese. By the way, you can speak freely about Golden Shield. We've covered it on the show. Our listeners will be familiar. Your description there doesn't really fully, I'm not fully satisfied with it, because if, for example, we had that same policy here, like if you described to me that America wanted our internet to be American and clean, it would strike me as very odd, right? This is a cultural thing. Where does that cultural thing come from with the Chinese, if not that history with Western imperialism? What is it that sort of drives these policies? How did we get to the place? Is it Mao Zedong? What is the origin of these sort of policies?
Well, certainly, I mean, it does resonate with Mao Zedong, but it does go back thousands of years. If you are familiar with the Chinese characters of Zhong and Guo, Zhongguo, which means China, it literally represents the center of the earth. The Chinese, for many years, as you know, ruled the planet. They were the de facto default king of the hill when it came to cultural expansion. Bring that forward throughout the years. Of course, they've had their slips. And what has happened then, what the Chinese people have discovered is when they are dissatisfied with the leadership, which is the basis for the current rules and a wholesome internet inside China, when the Chinese people historically have been dissatisfied with that, they rise up in an insurrection, again, not indicative of or reflective of what's happening here in the United States, and basically overthrow the government. So what you have essentially is under Hu Jintao, President Hu Jintao, who transitioned power to the new leader for life, President Xi Jinping in 2012, 2013, they are basically saying that any non-Chinese cultural mores will not be tolerated. And there are essentially 5 things that if you are a foreigner or even a Chinese can get you arrested and basically accused of being a spy in a loose sense are any Western religion, specifically Falun Gong, any anti-Chinese cultural rhetoric, any anti-Xi Jinping or anti-leadership mantras, and of course anything that has to do with pornography. Thus, some of the rules that they have passed regarding protection of children and some of the operating systems that they have tried to implement, which failed. But really, the internet of today in China really resonates within what they are trying to do is keep their honor clean in the face of a world that is essentially dissolving around them. The challenge, though, which is certainly part of what the narrative was or is here in China, is the Chinese were indeed afraid that if Trump were to remain president, it would perhaps lead to further destabilization. The fact that Biden, in this case, not to make this a political statement, is China-friendly in their eyes, they viewed their resolve to keep themselves in power as the Communist Party of China that much more resolute. And of course, now they're kind of pointing their fingers and saying, see, democracy doesn't work. So they do believe culturally, politically, militarily, linguistically, that they are indeed still the center of the earth. And that is one of their mandates, certainly the Project 2025, a number of other different, Made in China 2025, and a number of other programs really are being used to foment and publicize, promote that existence of China as the culture by which the rest of the world will be judged.
Okay. Now I want to talk about this weird little time in Chinese history, at least it seems from the outside, when all of these policies you just mentioned sort of seem to loosen up, starting with Deng Xiaoping and moving a little bit into Hu Jintao, specifically the building of China's internet. Because on our program, as I mentioned, we covered how, as an example, Nortel led the charge in building China's censored internet. Could you talk about what allowed for these kinds of arrangements and relationships to work between Western sort of freedom capitalism corporations and China's more authoritarian regimented communist party? How did that work? How did it arise? Because it's not really the most obvious pairing.
Yes. This is a very good question. And actually, while Nortel's core telco equipment was part of it, they were not the prime candidate and prime mover for the Chinese internet. In my first book, much of the internet infrastructure predates 1996. And in fact, in current events, their adaptation of IPv6 has encouraged and leads to the fact that they try to be technologically advanced. What that means then is at the time in history when they were building out the internet, they needed foreign experts. They needed Alcatel to give them the glass, the fiber, to build out the infrastructure. They needed Nortel to help them with the core routers to connect their universities, to connect their government. And they certainly needed Cisco in terms of helping them build the Great Firewall of China vis-a-vis the Golden Shield project. So they've had to rely heavily on Western technologies. Now, make no mistake that if you do bring intellectual property into the People's Republic of China and don't register it, and certainly in the early days, pre-96, even today, big companies, including Apple and others, are failing to realize that they need to register the intellectual property. If they do not, a Chinese citizen has the right in front of a Chinese court to claim that intellectual property as their own. And the Chinese government will always side on the side of the Chinese. And thus, the Chinese citizen will say, hey, you want to continue to introduce your broadband wireless, your mobile phones, your unique devices such as iPhone or iPad, then you need to pay me based on the adjudication of my lawsuit under Chinese law, the $1 million or so that I'm requesting of you. Otherwise, you will be forbidden from continuing to use or introduce your product into China. Now, this is important because if you look at Apple, 2012 or so, the market cap for China was $1 billion. Paying off $100 million to a Chinese person to satisfy a legal claim would be a drop in the bucket.
So 2012 is actually, it's not that long ago. Are there still Western companies who are still trying this, who are still participating in China's data infrastructure like they were back in 2003, 2004? Is this still happening? If so, how has the Chinese government approach changed from when they were working with Cisco, Nortel, and the like?
Yes. So answer your question in the order that you asked it, a very good one. There are successful Western companies that have actually adapted to these new, what we would regard as very invasive cybersecurity concerns regarding their national security as China. One of those is actually IBM. Now, historically, you and your listeners may remember that the Chinese had banned a variety of different technologies from not only the government, the military, but one of those in particular was the use of Western servers and server operating systems in the financial industry. And you can imagine companies that would perhaps provide those here in the West, so it just kind of caught them aghast. Well, IBM went to a company called Larkspur. Larkspur manufactures servers for the Chinese financial industry as the sole provider. And what IBM did, to their credit, is they gave them the processes, the procedures, and the methodology to create servers that would meet the requirements of the Chinese government using organic Chinese technology, while also keeping pace with the Western world regarding financial transactions internationally. So that's a good success story, actually.
TK music.